We're here today to talk about records of ancestors in prisons and asylums. And the reason I got interested in this project many years ago was that someone here on the Librarian Archives staff, before I was a member, showed me one of the ledgers on this table over here, which contained detailed information about prisoners in our state penitentiary in the 1840s. And eventually I used that information for a 2-volume work that I published called Tennessee Convicts. And I have to admit that several relatives of mine are in that book. As a matter of fact, my staff, when I was head of public services downstairs, if somebody was looking for that book, they used to call it Chuck's Genealogy. Records of our ancestors in prisons can be viewed in 2 different ways. A casual approach reveals a body of historical records that are fascinating and valuable in their detail. But on closer reflection, the misery and the evil reflected in these records will send a chill down your spine. Most people shrink from thinking very much about prisons, but the process of dealing with crime and criminals in the 19th century resulted in the creation of a huge body of records. They range from the minutes and case files of the local courts to records of gubernatorial pardons. For both the historian and the genealogist, these records are well worth investigating. And Tennessee in particular has done a good job of preserving those records. Some people find it embarrassing to have ancestors who were locked up, but I hope you will take the same approach that I do. What I do and say reflects on me, but what my ancestors did is history. It's fascinating, sometimes heart-wrenching to imagine, but is way beyond my control. So I just search and find and enjoy learning. I'm going to begin today's talk by speaking generally about the Tennessee prison records and the things that I learned from studying them. And as I do that, think about if you know of someone in your family who may have ended up in prison or in an asylum, the kinds of information you might glean from learning about them. And then after that, I'll talk about how to find prison records specifically, and then we'll talk a little about asylum and other kinds of institutional records. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. When George Cook walked through the brand new gates into the Tennessee State Penitentiary in 1831, he became the first of thousands of Tennesseans who would spend years of their lives in captivity there. Cook was a 21-year-old tailor who spent 2 years in the prison. His nights were endured in a dank cell only 18 inches longer than his 6-foot frame. He was forbidden to speak to any of the other 78 thieves, liars, murderers, and counterfeiters who joined him there during his stay. His family could not visit or write to him. He was entirely cut off from the world outside. None of these prisoners were allowed to talk to each other. They were confined in separate cells, and when outside the cell, they were always under the supervision of a guard. Occasionally, of course, guards would speak to prisoners to give orders, but the rules forbade any casual conversation. The restrictions on communication from outside the prison were just as strict. As set out in the laws governing the prison in 1829, they read, "The convict shall receive no letters or intelligence from or concerning their friends, or any information on any subject out of the prison, nor be permitted to write letters themselves. No relative or friend shall be allowed to speak to a convict except in some extraordinary case where the condition of his property or family imperiously requires it, and then only in the presence of the agent." Cook was found guilty of stabbing by a jury in Jackson, Madison County, and may have considered himself fortunate to be sent to the penitentiary. Several years earlier, this punishment for his crime would have included whipping and branding, as well as incarceration in a local jail. But local jails were not equipped to deal with prisoners for long periods. Before the state penitentiary was built, harsh punishments were imposed for most crimes. Hanging, whipping, branding, and cropping of ears were commonly meted out to criminals. The courts served as instruments of retribution, and shaming or frightening the criminal into submission was the only form of rehabilitation. This began to change in the 1820s as the American public came to believe that cruel and inhuman punishment was not appropriate in a democracy. A move took place to establish penitentiaries in many states, and this happened in 1829 in Tennessee when the legislature voted funds to build a penitentiary, and they revised the criminal code so that lengthy imprisonment and not bodily mutilation was the preferred form of punishment. These early prisons, obviously, were designed to keep people in and not to make them comfortable. In Tennessee, there were 200 cells and other buildings contained in an area about the size of a football field, all enclosed by a wall 20 feet high and 4.5 feet thick. Each cell was tiny, only 7 feet 6 inches long and 3 feet 6 inches wide, and 7 feet high. Imagine yourself locked in a room that size for a year or more. It was barely large enough for a grown man to lie down in. No furniture was provided and very little air flowed. Contagious disease could run rampant. Fast-acting cholera was a major threat. During the summer of 1833, our tailor friend George Cook lay in his hot and solitary cell and listened to other inmates retching and sobbing as 1 in 4 of the inmates died during a cholera epidemic that swept the prison. Those men were buried in the Nashville City Cemetery, and recently markers have been erected at their graves. This map shows the location of the Tennessee State Penitentiary at that time. You can see the Capitol here, and Cedar Street is Charlotte Avenue, and Spring Street is what's now Church Street, and this is Broadway. And if you ran all the way out Cedar or Spring Street, you would come to the penitentiary. Now today that's about in the area where just past where the interstate crosses Church and Charlotte, just west of those places. There is supposed to be, and I haven't had a chance to go look for it yet, but there's supposed to be one building remaining. To zoom in just a little bit, you'll see the penitentiary at the top of the map. And it was quite a ways out of town at that time, which of course was as people wanted it. The problem was they really didn't have a good water source, and that was an issue for the keepers of the prison going forward. One of the guiding principles of these early penitentiaries was to make a profit. Indeed, some of the early political rhetoric about the need for a prison to ensure more humane punishments is overshadowed by the emphasis given to the profit-making potential of a prison. Even the early reformers never intended for the convicts to be idle, as they were paying their debt to society by their incarceration. They were expected to contribute to their own upkeep through forced labor. This is a picture of the Tennessee State Penitentiary, the same building, about 1895. It was torn down in 1899, and the new one out on Centennial Boulevard was built. One great source of information about the penitentiary are sets of reports that were submitted by the head of the prison to the legislature every other year. Early reports of the prison agent in Tennessee always begin with a profit and loss statement from the prison workshops. In the narrative portion of these reports, prison officials often bemoaned the fact that too many men without useful skills were sent to the penitentiary. A great effort was made to teach each man a trade, not so much that it might help him to get a job when he got out, as because it would help him to earn his keep while in prison. The prison inspector's report in Tennessee in 1833 even went so far as to suggest to the legislature that prison terms of 1 year were not long enough, regardless of the crime, as the time was too short to learn a trade. A list of prisoners was included with each report, and from this information we draw a lot of what we know about individuals. Prisoners' information included in these reports was the name, the county where they had been convicted, and the length of their sentence. As prisoner number 1 in Tennessee, George Cook helped get the prison work program off to a good start. He was an experienced tailor and thus brought a useful trade to the prison. The records show that among his first duties was the making of his own uniform. Because of this emphasis on constructive labor, one of the critical pieces of information entered into each prisoner's record is his occupation. The vast majority of prisoners were listed as laborers, probably farm laborers. However, a remarkable number of the convicts reported some other skills. This table shows the occupations reported for all the prisoners admitted to the penitentiary through 1850. According to the 1840 census, 90% of men in Tennessee were farmers. Yet in the penitentiary, even if all the laborers are considered farmers, nearly 40% of the inmates had non-farming occupations. Several interesting possibilities come to mind. Could this indicate that farmers are less likely to commit crimes than other people? Or could it show that men in the crafts and trades were often drifters by necessity, without strong community ties, and more likely to be severely punished by a court when caught? It's certainly true that many prisoners were tried and arrested across the state or county lines from where their family lived. One example was Alexander Cohen of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a renovator and dyer. Does anybody know what a renovator is? I assume it has something to do with cloth.
They remade civil law uniforms usually.
This would have been before that, but reuse of cloth into new cloth. Who was found guilty of second-degree murder in Fayette County, Tennessee. So if you're looking for criminal ancestors, remember to look across the borders. In this Tennessee list, there are 462 convicts with non-farm occupations. About 20 of these might be considered professional criminals of one sort or another. Among the criminal class was counterfeiter Benjamin Foster. Although printing money was listed as Foster's occupation, he was actually in prison on charges of bigamy from the Hickman County Court. Prison records contain a lot of heart-wrenching stories. One Tennessee prisoner gave his life in the Civil War, but it was a decade before the war started. Richard Dillingham was a Quaker schoolteacher from Cincinnati who had been, quote, persuaded by some colored people there to go to Nashville to get some of their relations from a hard master. Dillingham was caught on the Cumberland Bridge with 3 slaves in his closed carriage and arrested in December of 1848. At his trial, Dillingham said that, quote, he alone was responsible for the error into which his education and his feelings of philanthropy, unquote, had led him. He entered the penitentiary in 1849 to serve a 3-year sentence. The prison keeper listed his occupation as abolitionist. This noble idealist died a year later of cholera while still incarcerated. A handful of inmates came from privileged backgrounds, and the harsh conditions at the prison must have come as a shock to them. In this Tennessee group, 9 school teachers, 3 merchants, 3 doctors, one of them, however, described as a quack, and a lawyer all came to the penitentiary during this early period. Richard Pruitt was a former member of the Indiana State Legislature who was caught stealing a horse in Tennessee and sent to the prison for 7 years. He sickened and died after only a year at the age of 41. In addition to rough living conditions, prisoners were oppressed by very strict rules mandated by the legislature. For example, if any prisoner shall neglect or refuse to perform the labor assigned to him, or shall willfully injure any of the materials, instruments, or tools entrusted to him, or shall engage in conversation with any other convict, either by words, gestures, or signs, he shall be punished by solitary confinement upon a diet of bread and water for a period not exceeding 30 days for each offense. So I think the opportunity to do labor for these people who were confined to these very small cells was almost felt to be a privilege. If you misbehaved, you couldn't go out to do labor, you had to stay in your cell. Under such circumstances, it is not surprising that escapes were attempted. Prison officials probably nipped many such efforts in the bud, but a few were successful. Most notable in Tennessee was the escape of 4 prisoners who were doing construction work on our new state capitol building in 1845, and they ran away from the job site. One of them, 25-year-old William Swaney, was drowned as he tried to swim across the Cumberland River. Swaney was only 3 months away from completing his 18-month sentence for killing a bull. The prison keeper ran an ad in the newspaper offering a $50 reward for the other 3 men, and all but one were recaptured. A similar ad was published in 1835 for the recapture of Charles Davis, a horse thief from Giles County. It reads at the end, quote, he took with him when he left a pair of new boots bound with yellow, a pair of gentlemen's calfskin shoes, and 2 pairs of ladies' calfskin shoes. I don't think this was part of his prison wardrobe. Can you imagine why he would have had such things? Think about the workshops. One of the workshops of the prison was a shoe manufactory. So they were teaching these men to make shoes and selling them in order to earn their keep, and he swiped some of the goods. Any group of historical records reveals an interesting pattern in names. Some of these boys in Tennessee who ended up in the penitentiary seem to have been destined for a life of crime, having been saddled with a name that required a tough exterior. For instance, we have Weekly Chick and Craven Butts. These prisoners' records usually include a detailed physical description. I think it was so that in case a prisoner escaped, the description could be published. The record of Louis de Saint-Léger reveals a man with a violent past. At only 29 years old, he bore bullet marks on his cheek, shoulder, hip, and arm, and scars on his face from the bite of a man. His conviction was for assault with intent to kill. In a letter to the governor regarding his application for a pardon, the state representative commented, quote, "He has led a dissipated life and has frequently been in broils and quarrels, threatening and attempting to take the lives of his adversaries," end quote. Reading along a little further, I was astonished to learn that this hardened criminal's occupation was portrait painter. Maybe those bullet holes came because he was such a poor one. I think we often fail to realize what a big part alcohol played in many of our ancestors' lives. In 1841, Tennessee prison officials conducted a survey of the inmates in an effort to help determine the causes of crime. Of 177 inmates who were in the prison at that time, 47% admitted to being constantly drunk, quote, when they could procure the means, end quote. 30 of these alcoholics claimed a tolerably fair education. 20 more said they could read and write and had been morally brought up. Regarding literacy, the number of prisoners who could read and write in 1839 was about 40%. Census figures on literacy are not available until 1850, but in that year, about 80% of Tennessee native-born adults were literate. So just as is true today, people with less education were back then far more likely to end up in prison. Laws of the period permitted even very young offenders to be imprisoned. The youngest person I found in the records prior to 1870 was 13-year-old Jesse Puckett, convicted of grand larceny by the Warren County Court. He served all of his 3-year term. There were 3 14-year-olds and 10 15-year-olds in the prison, all boys. These young prisoners may have been hardier than the others, as none of them died during their confinement. Even during the construction of the penitentiary, it was understood that men and women, whites and blacks, would be incarcerated there. Separate quarters were mandated by the legislature, but the punishment of women, even in this age of many biases, was strictly equal to that of men. 9 women can be identified in the penitentiary records from 1841 to 1850, as shown on this chart. Mahala Brewer returned for a second sentence in 1848 after having been out for 2 years, got arrested again. During the penitentiary's first 5 years, pardons were very rare. In fact, most of the inmates served several weeks or months beyond the date of their original sentence because penalties were added for misbehavior. Our friend George Cook was one who served his whole term plus an extra 2 months. Death was the only way to get out early, and many took it. But in 1836, the state legislature passed the nation's first good conduct law. It provided that governors should reduce sentences by 2 days for every month in which the prisoner conducted himself in, quote, with industry and propriety. There's actually a book among our penitentiary records here labeled the Good Time Book. I thought that was sort of ironic. Some of these prisoners actually went home and lived in their original communities, but many people who got out of prison left the area and tried to start over elsewhere, usually in the West, and for most Tennesseans that meant Texas. So how do we find these prison records? There are really two approaches. One is to go straight to the prison records and look for familiar names. The other is to work with local court records in the area where your ancestors lived and see how much trouble they got into. Let's talk about the first option, looking directly into the records. Remember that there is a difference between local jails and state prisons. People sentenced to minor crimes were put in the local jail for a short period. There are very few written records of these local jails. They tend to have been informally operated. I know a man whose father was the sheriff of Polk County, Tennessee, in the early 1900s. He grew up next door to the jail and told me that his mother cooked meals for the prisoners, and often the sheriff's family and the prisoner dined together, sort of like Andy Griffith. However, persons sentenced to prison terms of a year or more in Tennessee were sent to the state penitentiary. And in most states, they had a similar law. A year or 2 years could be served in a local jail, but anything beyond that would be in the penitentiary. Since the records of the state penitentiary are state records, you will most likely find them in the state archives of each state. Here in Tennessee, the penitentiary records are in record group 25. There are over 200 volumes listed in this inventory of the collection, ranging from 1831 to 1992. All of these volumes have been microfilmed, and the originals are here to be consulted upon request. And I've brought two of the early ledger books up for you to take a look at, and the one on the left is turned to the page about the portrait painter with all the wounds. I have scoured these records of the prison up through 1870 and published abstracts of each convict's entry into 2 volumes. I also use the biannual reports of the prison keeper and the lists that are included there, but a good researcher will always consult the original. And in these volumes, which are out of print but are available here in the library, and on this, I put copies on the table. Of course, I pulled out all the names mentioned in a record, not just the name of the prisoner, but of the relatives and others who are mentioned in his record. They go up through 1870. If you're working in another state and you're able to visit their state archives, you can discuss prison records with the archival staff. Ask them what records are available, how they are indexed, and how you can arrange to look through them. In Tennessee, these large ledger volumes list the prisoners chronologically in order of their arrival at the prison. For some periods of time, there is an accompanying alphabetical index. Another way to determine what prison records are available is to visit the website of the state archives. In your syllabus, I've given you the URLs for several sites, or for a site, which provides links to each state. Let me look at my handout so I can direct you to that. I believe it is on page 3, the links to state archives websites. So if you go to that URL, it will take you to each state archives. Go to their website and search for penitentiary, and you'll come up with what records they have available. I've also listed several examples of nearby states which have penitentiary records to some degree on their state website. Here's a page from the Colorado State Archives website. It contains information, a history of the state penitentiary, a description of the records available, photos of the prison, and an index of inmates. And on this site, you can search for the names of prisoners. Here's the entry for another guy whose name portends trouble, Joe Abad. The index gives you their prisoner number and the book number. Using that book number, you can determine the approximate time period of incarceration, but then you would have to contact the archives for more information about the entry. If the state in which your ancestor lived does not have records of prisons in the state archives, don't despair. In most states, the person in charge of the prison was required to submit an annual report. They're often printed, and they usually include a list of the inmates. In Tennessee, these lists were published in the legislative journals until about 1910. And I have a couple of samples on the table here for you to look at. If you'll take a look at the first page of your handout, the first item is a sample entry from the report of the North Dakota Penitentiary in 1883. Although there was not a complete list of prisoners in the report, it does include information about each prisoner who was discharged during the past year. So we learned, for instance, that James Stanton had been in prison for 4 years and 6 months. so he must have gone in about 1879, and that his place of destination when he left the prison was Fargo. It's not everything we might want to know about James Stanton, but it's a good start. I also want to point out to you the name of the third prisoner on that list, obviously Oriental, named Ah Chu. And according to my son, who was looking this over just this week, there's a character in a movie, a famous movie, whose name is Ah Chu, but I don't remember what movie he said it was. But anyway, what's that? Men in Tights. That's right, Robin Hood, Men in Tights. Obviously, we have a distinguished movie watcher among us. To find this kind of a list here in Tennessee is pretty easy. The legislature in Tennessee had a session every 2 years, so that's how often the prison keeper had to report. The House and Senate journals are published volumes, and they include all the votes taken and kind of a chronology of what happened during the legislative session. But at the end of that chronology are the various reports that were submitted. And they're reports of the agency heads, including the penitentiary, but also the lunatic asylum, the school for the deaf, etc. So all of those reports and lists can be found in the legislative journals. And these are shelved here at the State Library and Archives in the North Reading Room. So not the main reading room, but on the other side of the lobby, you'll find these. To find lists like these in other states, and this example is from Illinois, you can search the state library's catalog online. You can also check a published guide from 1950, which I have in your syllabus, which lists all of the publications of each state government published by the Library of Congress. And you can also try Google Books or Hathy Trust, which is another great site for digitized books online. I was able to find the Illinois State Penitentiary reports, not all of them, but about a dozen of them before 1900, digitized on Hathy Trust. Turning back to the syllabus on page 1 in the North Dakota example, this brings up another place that you can look for information about prisoners and people in asylums, the census. James Stanton's record proves that he was in prison in 1880, so a search of the Dakota Territorial Census of 1880 should reveal his entry. So the census will tell his age and place of birth, information that we didn't get from this prison report. So use all of those records, cross-checking each one. For those ancestors who were institutionalized during a census year, don't forget to search the census for detail. And in 1880, there are separate schedules called the DDDs, the defective, delinquent, and dependent census schedules, which do include people in all kinds of institutions in the state. Those are available on Ancestry and are indexed there, as well as here in microfilm. Defective, dependent, and delinquent. If you'll look, well, where are we here? The entry with Ah Chu in it is the California entry on page 1. Also points out another place to look for information about prisoners, and that would be the papers of the governor of each state. In most states, the governor had the power to offer a pardon. So even if your jailbird relative was not pardoned, it's quite likely that he or his family or friends petitioned the governor and requested a pardon. Governor's papers are usually found in the state archives. And one of my first experiences in finding an ancestor in prison came because I was looking through the published papers of President Polk. And while he was governor, he received a letter from the brother of the man who was in prison, and both brothers were sons of my ancestor. And he was asking for a pardon for his younger brother who was in the penitentiary for murder from Coffee County. What was really interesting about it was that the brother who was not in prison was in the state legislature, and he was writing that it was a great embarrassment to him to have his brother in the penitentiary, so wouldn't the governor please let him out? He got out early, yes. Since that time, I've often worked with governor's papers. They can be very big collections, but most of the time they'll include a separate group of folders titled Petitions for Pardon. These will include letters from family members or from the prisoner himself pleading for the release of a loved one. There's an example here. The the governor's papers here in Tennessee are all listed, and the inventories of those papers are available on the website of the State Library and Archives. And then the papers themselves have a box and folder inventory. You can see that Governor Aaron Brown did not have a very large collection, only 10 boxes, but boxes 7 through 10 are all filled with petitions for pardon. So it was a big part of the paperwork that they retained. And of course, all of those are available here to be looked at on microfilm, or we do have the originals, and you can always request to see the original as well. If your ancestor was in the penitentiary for a long period of years, be sure to check the papers of each governor who was in office during that period. He would have tried afresh to find a sympathetic ear each time a new man was elected. So now let's think about other records of other kinds of institutions, generally called asylums. That term usually brings the word insane to mind, but there were different kinds of asylums. Many of the strategies you use for finding prison records are the same for finding asylum records. If you look at the bottom of page 1 of your syllabus, you see some sample entries from the Virginia State Journal listing mentally ill people confined in county jails. This was being compiled in order to make the case for having a state asylum. As you can see, the information about William Martin from Floyd County is very specific. We have his age, his residence, we know how long he was ill, and some detail about the nature of his illness. Now, this was not an annual listing in Virginia, but tidbits like these are buried in state records everywhere and well worth the search. I found this record using Hamrick's Guide to Early State Records, which I mentioned earlier, and which is on page 3 of your syllabus, and a copy is available online, as well as here in the library. This is the cover of Hamrick's Guide and a sample page, this page from Connecticut, showing that among the state's publications were records of their asylum for the deaf and dumb. Now, I also have an extract from the record, the published report of that asylum at the top of page 2 in your handout. And you'll see that this institution was in business in the very early 1800s. This report is from 1819, so it's a very early record. It was even included some letters from inmates in the asylum for the deaf and dumb in order to help show the legislators what the lives of these people were like. So here's a sample from one of those letters written in 1820. My dear cousin Robert, I take a good opportunity to write to you. My sister Sally and I wrote twice. I want very much to see you, but I must stay in the asylum and learn. And goes on to talk about her sister Polly. So this is not only a glimpse into a family member's life, but also some really good genealogical connections that are shown in this letter. And again, unless you just kind of go looking for this sort of thing, you might never find it. So those reports that are published in the state journals can be very helpful. The Tennessee Lunatic Asylum opened in 1840, about 10 years after the penitentiary. It was located where Division Street meets 12th Avenue South, right where all the activity of the Gulch is centered these days. Archival records of the Lunatic Asylum in Tennessee have not survived, but we have a good series of annual reports to the legislature. Unfortunately for the researcher, these reports do not list inmates by name. However, the reports do describe them by number. And you can get enough information about a person that if you knew something about an ancestor and you thought they were in the asylum, you might be able to identify them in this numbered list. You can see that such causes as religious fanaticism, domestic trouble, and fright are given as the causes of their mental problems. On the county level, people with mental and other afflictions were sometimes cared for in institutions called poorhouses or poor farms. People who couldn't manage on their own and had no family support could be sent to these government-funded homes. They provided little care other than food and shelter. This picture shows the one in Overton County about 1910. Not much in the way of records was kept for these poor farms. However, when a person was committed to the poorhouse, the county court was the agency that did the committing in Tennessee. And so there will be an entry in the county court minutes that says that so-and-so was sent to the poor farm. In the center of page 2 in your handout is an entry representing yet another kind of asylum, one for the blind. These were built in almost every state, and often their records have been lost, but these lists, which appear in the reports of the state legislature, provide the names of students and their counties of residence, enough to identify a likely ancestor. Tennessee also had and still has a school for the blind. Ours was established in 1844. The original building burned during the Civil War, and afterward the Claiborne Mansion on Hermitage Avenue was purchased for the school. That's the building shown here. Records of this school in the archives didn't begin until 1905 and are mostly confidential due to the health information they contain. However, we do have a good set of published reports, just like with the prisons, and these contain lists of the students. Here's an example from the 1873 report. This page was the entire student population, so this was a small school. But what's especially interesting about this report from 1873 is that it also includes this list of young blind people from all over the state who were not in the school. So they were trying to understand how many people could potentially be coming to the school and took this census. Again, this is in the back of the Legislative Journal in Tennessee for that year. Sometimes people other than inmates are mentioned in the records of asylums. On page 2 of your handout at the bottom is a report from the Lunatic Hospital of Williamsburg, Virginia. It's disappointing that there are no registers of inmates given, but even the accounting records that are provided have clues in them. Note that the names of 2 discharged patients are listed, Emily and Francis, and their counties of residence are also given. So when you do find records of these institutions, you may not always find a list of inmates, but there are other records that may be helpful from which you can glean details. The websites of state agencies are helpful in working with asylum research. This example is from the Indiana State Archives page for their collection of records from the Hospital for the Insane. It provides a history of the institution and a description of the records available. And you can see there is a reference to the commitment records database. And then it says not available online. However, if you click on it, voila, it actually is online. They need to do a little work on their website. And so I used the index to look for Sherrills in the Indiana Asylum, and there were quite a few. And it doesn't tell me much about them, but I do get their name, the year incarcerated or institutionalized, and the county they lived in, so I may be able to write the archives to get more information about some of them. Let's talk a little bit about confidentiality. Most states have confidentiality records which restrict access to, confidentiality laws which restrict access to medical or mental health records. In some states, this restriction is just for a period of years, so you may be able to get to records before 1900, for example, but not after. In other states, access is permitted only for people who can prove that they are directly related or for medical purposes. In Tennessee, we have the most restrictive confidentiality law I know of. Mental health records in Tennessee are restricted indefinitely and require a court order and proof of medical need before the information can be released. In all my years here at the archives, I've never known of anyone to bring a court order to view these records, although we do have some. I think that's a law that needs to be changed. I don't think it's reasonable that 100-year-old records should still be confidential. And we are working with the Department of Mental Health to try and change the law that restricts those records, but it is a very cumbersome, complex process, but we will persevere.
What can we do to help?
Well, I think at this point we need to work through the logistics, but once it actually becomes a bill before the legislature to change the law, I'd like to contact people who are on our mailing list or people who are members of the Genealogical Society and ask them to encourage their legislators to vote in favor of that bill. Remember that even where there are strict confidentiality laws, those laws are modern ones. So old publications, such as these reports we've been looking at, were made public before the law was passed, and they're still on the shelves and still available to view, despite the laws governing unpublished records. To learn about what confidentiality laws apply in each state, the easiest thing to do would be to talk to the archives staff. And a telephone call doesn't cost much. You can usually call and get hold of someone who's on duty in the reference room and just say, do you have any of these records and under what conditions are they available? I wanted just quickly to mention another group of records that you might not think about, and they are for the Civil War period. At the bottom of page 3 of your handout are references to 3 collections, which we have here on microfilm, but are also now available on either Ancestry or Fold 3 online, and we have free access here to those databases. They include records of the Union Provost Marshal, who was the military official responsible for managing civilian affairs in an occupied territory. So Nashville was occupied for the better part of the war, so there are a lot of Nashville records included in these. And the state penitentiary was taken over by federal officials, and so during that period in the Civil War, we don't have penitentiary records because they dismissed everybody who was affiliated with the penitentiary and put the Army in charge. But the records of the Army are often reflected in these Provost Marshal records because they were arresting Confederate spies and people who were causing problems and putting them in prison, and so their names will come up in these collections. And also, of course, if you have a Civil War soldier who ended up being captured and imprisoned, you'll find a card in their military service file that indicates that they were sent to prison. But to actually look at the records of that prison where they're listed and where you might learn other information, you should look at the National Archives microfilm collection of those records. Again, I believe those are available on Fold 3. Well, that's all I had prepared for you today, but if you have any questions, I would be glad to try and answer them. Oh, no, I do have one other thing. I wanted to tell you that in Kentucky, they have a very liberal law regarding, or at least they did several years ago, regarding mental health records. And I had a friend whose great-grandmother was in the asylum in Kentucky, and she was able to get a full copy of her file. And this just gives you an idea of the sorts of things that were there. The lady's name was Fanny Holland, and she was admitted in 1928 at the age of 66. She tells her birthplace in 1862 in Warren County, Kentucky. She was a widow with 4 children, the youngest of whom was 38. Her father was Julius Justice, born in Warren County, and her mother was somebody Williams, born in Sampson County. She had been educated through the 5th grade. She was a Baptist, and it asked what other relatives have been insane, and it named an aunt and 2 cousins named Hendel. And supposed cause of mental illness, this information was given by her father. Now, this lady was 66 years old, but her father was apparently admitting her, and he said she had a trifling husband who took her property, leaving Fanny and her children destitute. It also had information about the frequency of her symptoms and the type of symptoms, and some other medical information, including whether she had any false or peculiar ideas. So these records, if you can get to them, can be very informative and sad as well. Well, thank you all for coming today, and good luck with your research.